Thank you very much. So now we switch to English for our first panel, whose title is Building Resilience Against Geopolitical Headwinds. Well, geopolitical headwinds is a euphemism in this period. I mean, we are in the middle of a war. There is an incredible lack of trust at the international level. Even at the G20 level, we cannot reach an agreement. And yes, there are some guidelines, there are some agreements in the ministerial meetings, also in infrastructures. Still, there is no real implementation. And what we are witnessing at the moment is also a duplication of infrastructure projects with the risk of overlappings, with the risk of inefficient use also of investment. So this is basically what we are going to discuss today, but I don't want to steal time because we have an incredible panel today, and I want to, let me just introduce them, starting of course from the right, starting from Alicia Garcia-Herrero. Thank you very much, Alicia, for being with us. She is at ISPI, our senior advisor. She is a senior fellow at Bruegel, chief economist for Asia Pacific at Natixis in Hong Kong. Thank you very much, Alicia. And we have online, so let me introduce them right away, Raffaele Della Croce, co-director of the Singapore Green Finance Center, advanced research fellow at the Imperial College Business School. Thank you very much, Raffaele Della Croce, for being with us. Herald Reuters, Director, Investment, Innovative and Sustainable Transport and Acting Deputy Director General at the DG Mobility and Transport at the European Commission. Thank you very much. And then, last but not least, Amitendo Palit, Senior Research Fellow and Research Lead at the Institute of South Asian Studies, NUS. So, thank you all for joining us today. Let me start with Raffaele Della Croce. Mr. Della Croce, climate change is definitely taking its toll on infrastructures. So basically, how should we build, maintain, restore infrastructure to make them future-proof? So to take into consideration also the challenges posed by climate change. Please.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. So the climate change impact on infrastructure is clearly something that the IPCC reports have been telling us for a few years now. Just the last reports were highlighting the rising sea levels, risk of droughts, extreme wildfires, shifting rainfalls, and so forth. And this is, as it was just said, in addition to the COVID situation we went through, the Ukraine war, and what happened to the dam physical infrastructure with the damages to the vast territory and then to the population, to floodings in Germany, Belgium, Italy. So it's an urgent situation we need to fix, and infrastructure is clearly having a huge impact now, and even more so going forward. But there is an opportunity. The opportunity is coming from the recovery plan in Europe. Attached to the funding, there are clearly precise climate objectives, including about resilience that we need to comply with in order to spend according to the European Commission objectives and targets. So if you have to look at quickly about imperatives, about how to rebuild in a resilient way our infrastructure system, which is as this vulnerability aspect of having this network system, which has cascading sort of risks across the system. Well, first of all, we need to have a systemic approach, which means including these climate adaptation and resilient measures in the governance process, from the design of the project to the construction, to the monitoring, the implementation. And this has to come from the government, from a government perspective. In terms of approach, what is missing, what has often been missing in the past, and more importantly, in an adaptation climate consideration, is the long-term horizon and the life cycle approach, the asset management, which needs to be taken into account from a public and from a private sector point of view. The good news is that compared to the past, we do have opportunities, and digitalization is offering actually a major breakthrough in several parts of this infrastructure value chain, considering climate change. Among the ones that are relevant for adaptation and resilience is the data management, the possibilities that big data using sensors, using satellites, data which is more and more available, can be technically analyzed through machine learning sort of analysis. ChatGPT is a new potential with which we still actually at Imperial College, where I am at the moment, we're really very much looking at the moment what is feasible and what it can be applicable to the climate change sort of industry from the new developments. That allows a better monitoring of our infrastructure physical asset and more capacity to react, but also to preempt the risks that we're going to face going forward using risk management, scenario analysis, probabilities, and those set of modeling and thinking and planning which is needed ex ante before the crisis hit our infrastructure physical asset. Another aspect, which is another opportunity that is very relevant for this discussion, is the building with nature, shifting from gray to green infrastructure, which means where possible, integrate nature-based solution into the design of our infrastructure. So this could go from the garden, the greening of our cities, which could be small sort of structural intervention, to larger, instead of sea walls protecting from the rising of the sea, having mangroves, which is something in emerging markets is something which is very much explored. But in order to do this, we need to go back to the first point, having the systemic approach, having consideration, what are the damages and the risks we're going to face going forward, and what are the options, considering green infrastructure, one of the options to respond to that. If I have just 1 minute more, I'll try to say one additional point. In consideration about how to react to this crisis, it's not just about infrastructure, of course. It's more than that. There are co-benefits going to the economy, to the society, linked to the user of the infrastructure, to the services, and to the economy more broadly. So in order to quantify those benefits, there is a huge work that still has to be done connected to the investor appetite for ESG and sustainability. But how to quantify those co-benefits is important from a public sector and private sector perspective. And that is where the research is heading now, and where I think we need to focus going forward in order to attract also the relevant capital, the private sector capital, which is needed to finance this transition and this adaptation gap.
Thank you very much, because you set the stage for this session of providing this broad overview. Now let's see how the European Union fits in this framework. You emphasized, of course, the challenges for infrastructures related to climate change, but most of all also the opportunities. So now let me turn to Erhard Reuters. Mr. Reuters, in your capacity at the European Commission, my question for you is the European Union really ready in terms of investment, in terms of planning, in terms of adapting its infrastructures, starting, for instance, from TEN-T? Are we doing enough to get ready to be resilient and sustainable for the future when it comes to infrastructures? Please.
Antonio, good afternoon, and I hope you hear me well.
Yes, we do.
Good. Thank you for the occasion to bring forward also the view and the actions of the European Commission. In fact, the Commission is very actively pursuing this whole debate on a resilient transport sector and a resilient Europe thereby as well, that functions in its internal market and across it also to third countries. We have proposed a new TEN-T regulation, which is there to connect member states between each other with a specific emphasis on cross-border, and with very clear deadlines what shall be realized by 2030, 40 and 50. If you would ask me, is the Union resilient at this moment in its transport sector, the clear answer is no. there are too many of our member states which are not connected between each other. And we have seen at the light of the crisis of COVID, but also in Ukraine, that this is sometimes making a real issue for our working of the internal market. If at some point, like in Ukraine, you cannot use anymore the Black Sea and you have to travel only via the land borders, you can clearly see how little the resilience of our system today is. If I look at the Italian situation, for instance, where the networks of Italy are not well interlinked with, for instance, France or Germany to the north, then it is clear that in case of a major disruption, you do not have, let's say, the resilience of your transport system to cope with that. So if the Brenner corridor, for instance, is entirely cut off due to landslide and after heavy rainfall, then one of your major, let's say, transport corridors is cut out. And therefore, we need to work on that. We need to make sure that the TEN-T network is functional by 2030, 40, and 50 in the different deadlines, and make sure that we have a resilient Europe which is well interconnected. We are doing that step by step with the help also of the Connecting Europe facility. And last week, we have approved 6.2 billion for 107 projects across the Union. For instance, 700 million go to the Brenner Base Tunnel works. We also had more than 40 million going to Avigliana Bussoleno on the, for instance, Lyon-Torino connectivity. And these are the things that we need to pursue. So, Antonio, when you're asking me, is the Union ready? Then my answer is we are certainly not ready today, but we are on a good way. And I hope that by the end of this year, we will have a new TEN-T legislation in place, and that we also can still work with the current Connecting Europe facility to decline that in projects that matter, that make the difference. But for the future, a little bit like what Raffaele was saying, for the future, we still have a lot of work to be done. So we're engaged into detailed studies, also in direct connection with the ICCP, in order to see what does this mean, this climate change, and what does it mean to be climate resilient or to have the necessary adaptation. But beyond that, we also would like to see what do we have in terms of sufficient resilience geopolitically. Also in terms of defense, in terms of military mobility, in terms of the changing world in which we are, in terms of reshoring. If we want to have products coming from the mining in Finland or energy from Italy or Spain in the south, we need to make sure that Europe is resilient in a whole approach, not only for climate, but in general for all of the fields. And therefore, we need to make sure that we not only have a TEN-T adopted by the end of the year, but that we have strong instruments which are underpinning, in particular, also the funding and financing. Then I will be, I think, at ease that we can, in Europe, with all of the tools available, digital, funding, financing, stronger cross-border connectivity, that we can be ready for this type of events that will come ever more frequently in the next years. Back to you, Antonio.
Thank you very much, Erad. Thank you also for very transparently highlighting what are the holes in the cheese, in the European cheese. There is much more to be done, hopefully, of course, with the new regulation or with the new decisions. But now let's jump very far from us. Let's go to China. To an export-led country, and what are the needs for China in terms of infrastructure? I mean, what is the sustainability, also the Chinese growth over the next year, looking at the infrastructures? I mean, they are enough, they are investing enough, they are, preparing a resilient and sustainable infrastructure for their future, for the future development. Please.
Well, first of all, thanks for the invite. It's really a pleasure to be here. It's an old city for me. I've studied in Milan, so I really love the idea of sharing my views here at ISPI. I want to actually do two things, if you allow me. First, I'll talk a little bit about China's infrastructure drive, what it means, but I also want to talk about China's presence in our infrastructure, because this is part of the resilience we were talking about. So on the first part, I think China, at the current juncture, is well ahead in its infrastructure drive. If anything, China has gone perhaps past what it should have, and there's a lot of projects that are not as profitable as they should have been, just for the mere fact that China has a humongous investment to GDP ratio, much of which has gone to infrastructure. That doesn't mean that not all of the infrastructure is there. China is now investing mainly in digital industrial infrastructure, and not so much on transport infrastructure, because that's where basically the bulk of it. I would say still transport is there, railway, a high-speed railway, but more as a way to grow than as a need. And therefore, I would imagine that what we should focus on is this idea of actually industrial infrastructure. I mean, what it means for us is that China is going to be able to compete humongously on industrial digital infrastructure. I should repeat the word digital so that we all understand where we stand. This is a major endeavor that should put China in a very on an even better competitive landscape compared to us. So I just want to highlight that. This is 5G, 6G, version 6 intranet, you name it. I mean, many of these projects. And again, moving a little bit away from physical infrastructure, although some of it is still there just to grow, because this is the way China has learned to grow. But I want to move to another aspect of resilience, and I think we heard a little bit already about the fact that resilience is not only about climate change, although climate change is obviously very important. But to be frank, we have had two major events in Europe that do show very clearly that there's more to resilience than climate, and that is the pandemic and the war in Ukraine. And we cannot simply forget that this has consequences for infrastructure in a broad sense. I think that the issue here is that there is a kind of an elephant in the room, which is the control of infrastructure, and where infrastructure is critically important, and what it means in terms of foreign ownership. I'm nobody to judge how much that foreign ownership should be. I guess the European Commission has its own regulations, and that's all fine with me, but I just want to give you a hint as to where we stand with China's presence in our infrastructure. This is just based on a testimony for US Congress on EU-China relations and the part specifically on security, EU security regarding China. So if we start with ports very quickly, we basically have as many as something like 11 to 20. And interestingly, it's very hard to know the number because the actual ownership is very hard to track. And this is something we need to realize. Ports either controlled by COSCO, China Merchant, or in some cases Hong Kong Hutchinson Port. And there are quite a few of those, by the way, in my home country in Spain. Some have been, other places such as, Australia have stopped some of these investments. In Europe, so far, we've been quite open to, of course, the best example now is Hamburg. We all know about that specific case where the EU-level inward investment screening device, which actually reported negatively on that ownership, was then basically ousted, if I may say so, by the decision of the German government. So all in all, at least 10 European countries, and of course the most obvious case, or the most full operation basically in control is Piraeus since 2016. Then we move to airports. The story there is very different. because during the global financial crisis, the European sovereign crisis, we did have a lot of airports actually being transferred to Chinese hands: Toulouse, Frankfurt, Han, Tirana. Tirana was actually a leasing, and these ports have come back to the authorities. But there's still some small minority stakes in the transmission system in 11 member states. Then we have, sorry, this is incorrect what I just said. I just moved too quickly. Yes, there was also a divestment in Swissport. So ports is more like divestment story as opposed to, airports are a divestment story, ports are an investment story so far. Interestingly, the grid is an investment story, nuclear is a divestment story. So you see very different approaches, right or wrong. This is something that I would not be able to explain, why some are moving in and others are moving out, but that's what's happening. On the investment story, we have the electric grid, obviously, and renewables. This is Energias de Portugal, EDP, and also in Spain, increasingly renewables. On nuclear, it's the other way around. So basically, since Hinkley Point, 32% funded by China General Nuclear, it's actually basically no new investment allowed, and that's this investment story. So very different trends. On the telecommunication is, I would say, more divestment story, 5G. So you have still 19 members, Huawei is present, but the level of presence is decreasing over time. And finally, and this is actually increasing, so you get 3 of each, basically. This is subsea cables. Subsea cables, you have China with a new 5 million undersea fiber optic internet cable, connecting Hong Kong, Hainan, Singapore, Pakistan, Saudi, Egypt, and France, only country in Europe, which is basically competing with the US-backed 6 million program, CME-WE6 called, and this is basically connecting other points of Europe. So why do I want to say all of this, and I finish here, is that the story is not so much whether there's enough resilience or there isn't. I'm nobody to judge, but what I can see is that there's different trends across different types of critical infrastructure. And I wonder why that is the case. What is the perceived risk, or is this just a market movement, or is it not? It seems very, the trend across countries is very similar if you look at, say, 5G, the divestment. So there has to be something else that I may be missing for this to happen. And the question is, are we fully aware? Is there anything we should be doing? I leave it up there for Q&A.
Thank you very much, Alicia. It's very telling that you emphasize the problem of the Chinese ownership of European infrastructures, because infrastructures, of course, are strategic assets for countries. So in an international context, with increasing competition, with weaponized competition, of course, it's something that we have to look very closely. It's not a case that there is, the recent new document of the European Commission on the strategic European security, considering also the implementation of new monitoring also of our FDI and our export. So it goes, in this overall context. Now let me move to Amitendo Palit. Amitendo, in this context of increasing competition, what is happening to infrastructure? I mean, we talk about friendshoring, nearshoring, reshoring, all the shoring that we want. Are infrastructure adapting to this new international landscape? Please.
Thank you so much, Antonio. In the beginning, I must express my great delight in the invitation that you've extended to me. It's an honor to be a part of this very distinguished panel. I think let me bring one particular perspective to the notice of this very august audience, and this is the fact that the entire subject of resilience, when viewed from the perspective of businesses, Businesses have always been worried about resilience primarily because of the fact that in a large number of areas of sourcing of materials, sourcing of intermediates, and in terms of the infrastructure that accompanies that sourcing, principally the logistics, there has been the rather exceptional predominance of a few countries. And this predominance is something which has led to what we broadly define as concentration across a large number of supply chains, which are noticed in very critically sensitive supply chains as well. For example, energy, food, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, and so on and so forth. When we connect this to the idea of resilience, I think there is one thought that comes out. That thought is that this entire concentration, or the fact that businesses have deliberately relied more on a few specific countries, and China notably is one of those countries, to source their inputs, source their services. That was not an irrational decision. That was a rational decision because that concentration was economically justified. Simply because of the fact that China and a few other countries with their capacities were able to deliver these products and services better than others. But at the same time, there were also these fears that if, say, for example, there are disruptions that come out in the pattern and the character of this sourcing, then what would happen? So there were these episodes in the past, let's say, for example, beginning from the 2002 SARS outbreak of the epidemic in Asia. Then we had the Fukushima earthquake, the massive floods in Thailand and Bangkok in 2011. And even later, towards the end of the last decade, we have seen systemic outages in IT infrastructure, cyber attacks, which have caused these disruptions. But what was noticed during COVID-19 was something very different. And the COVID-19 made it very clear that once these disruptions start coming in, they might actually not just, stop. They might just keep on building one after the another, because as the pandemic spreads its impact across various parts and regions of the world, and these very crucial centers of production, for example, the Wuhan province in China, which has headquarters of around or business presences of more than 500 Fortune 500 companies, when all those sourcing patterns get critically disrupted, the infrastructure governing the supply chains gets hit very badly. So in that context, two things happen. The first is this entire idea that concentration of sourcing of materials and services is economically justified if it is from a few countries, needs to be backed with a different rationale. And that rationale is accommodating for black swan or semi-black swan events like the COVID-19 to ensure that the infrastructure that supports resilience of supply chains need to be supported through a de-risking or diversification of sourcing and access. And this is where this imperative was also strengthened by the fact that COVID-19 produced a very different kind of geopolitics. And the geopolitical construct actually made it, in a sense, much more imperative for businesses. And for the first time since the onset of economic globalization 35 years ago, for the first time, the businesses were being actually brought into working together with governments. So it was the B and G working together to produce a strategy which will be a broad reflection and implementation of a China plus one strategy. And the China plus one strategy might not necessarily be the most economically rational strategy, because that strategy calls for relocation of bits and parts of very prominent supply chains from within the mainland, or maybe within the territorial influence of the mainland, to other parts and other areas where the supply chains would get that much of assured comfort of being more resilient. Now, this has started happening through the announcement of a very large number of policy initiatives across the Asia and Pacific, and the more recent advancement of the Indo-Pacific. Now, what I would like to kind of share with you at this instance, in the back of what I said right now, is that This entire issue of resilience and infrastructure and supply chain resilience, which businesses are facing, is primarily backed by a very, very fundamental dilemma. That fundamental dilemma arises from the fact that supply chains and the infrastructure around them have been organized on the basis of economic efficiency. And this economic efficiency logic was an outcome of economic globalization. But today, that economic efficiency logic needs to be supplemented, or if I could put that across, needs to be contradicted by a geopolitical logic, which argues for repositioning of the same supply chains, not necessarily on economic efficiency grounds, but on geopolitical grounds. Now, there is a fundamental contradiction here. And as a result of that, many businesses which understand the geopolitical necessity of repositioning supply chains are unfortunately not able to completely convince themselves on the grounds of economic efficiency for taking production out of China. So this is where the initial post-COVID reaction to friendshoring, which was surrounded by this very hard narrative of decoupling from China, has now got to be increasingly replaced by de-risking, working with China while at the same time de-risking and perhaps pushing a narrative of diversification of sourcing. There are a huge number of financial incentives which are being offered by a large number of countries, beginning from the United States to the Chips and Science Act. The Japanese government has announced it, the Australian government has announced it, the Indian government and the Korean government have announced it. But the bigger question that comes up over here is that whether one-time or closed-ended financial incentives are sufficient for businesses to actually reposition themselves territorially in order to accommodate the geopolitical concerns. I'll stop here and wait for further questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much also for highlighting this crucial point. I mean, infrastructure, of course, are designed and conceived taking economic efficiency as the most important part of the decision. But of course, in the new international context, the geopolitical concerns are key. So let me move back now to Erhard Reuters. Erhard, I know that you have to leave us in 4 minutes or so, but is the European Union really taking into consideration also these geopolitical reasons? Because for us, basically means looking at East, so of course, including Ukraine, and reconstruction of Ukraine, but also looking south at the Mediterranean. Please.
Thank you, Antonio, and very interesting contributions, really inspiring from Amitanu and from also from Alicia. It is exactly what I tried to explain, that for me, resilience is not only a climate resilience, but in particular a geopolitical resilience. I see more and more impacts from COVID and the war in Ukraine that are in fact exemplary on what is coming towards us. And I'm not, let's say, saying that the climate resilience will be away. I see an intensification there as well of events which will, to my feeling, be forcing us to think about how we deal with climate resilience. But geopolitically speaking, it is just as important to consider what needs to be done in the future. The 10T, as you can see also on the map behind me, is extending therefore its corridors through the Western Balkans and also into Ukraine and Moldova, because we firmly believe that these territories and these states will be reaching out towards the Union. We also have to look on the southern shores of the Mediterranean, as you were indicating, Antonio, because also there we expect that there will be a need for a good connectivity beyond the Union. But again, I underline that also within the Union, we still have quite a bit of work to do in order to make sure that when we do reshore activities into Europe, or that we are trying to connect within Europe for the new flows, that we still must make sure that this is functioning in a new logistics framework. It's not for sure that all the goods will come via the high seas between the East and the Far East towards Europe and towards the Americas. It will also be that we will see more intensive flows within Europe, also on short sea shipping, and that we will need to reflect whether we are ready for those type of, let's say, geopolitical relocations under the same time also under this threat of climate resilience. And I think that also if we look at certain of the measures taken by Europe within the Green Deal and the Fit for 55, like the extension of the ETS, the emission trading system, I believe that these are also going to have impacts on the logistic streams and on the way how we deal with those within the European context. So to resume, Antonio, I believe firmly that we have not seen the last of what needs to be done in Europe and between Europe and the third countries or neighbors. We need to make sure that we have sufficiently powerful and clear governance in place, with notably, for instance, the new TEN-T. And we need to make sure that we have sufficient instruments that can deal with resilience. That is, on the one side, for me, in funding and financing instruments to make sure that this is happening, in particular cross-border projects. And then, of course, we also need to be looking into whether we are sufficiently robust, geopolitically speaking, in terms of military mobility, defense, security, and whether we are connecting the dots in terms also of investments that Alicia was also highlighting too. So you hear me clearly, Antonio and colleagues, that I think that we are on the right track, but we are certainly not arrived to the final destination that we can say that we are in a good place. Back to you, Antonio.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Erad. I know that you have to leave. I hope you will be with us anytime soon again. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So now let me turn again to Raffaele. Raffaele, if we look at the infrastructure at the global level, there is a big push also coming from actually a multilateral institution which is in crisis, the G20. But the G20 keep asking its members to invest in better infrastructures, resilient, sustainable infrastructures. Still, I mean, governments are not really in line, are not really implementing, I mean, what they themselves, I mean, they have decided at the G20 level. So what should be done at the national level also to be in line with the guidelines, with the instructions and commitments of the G20? And what is the role also for the private sector? Please.
Yeah, so the G20 has been advocating for investment infrastructure for some time, and it was the merit of the Italian presidency in 2021 to bring up the resilient and maintenance aspect of infrastructure at the G20 level and making it a priority. So the World Bank and the OECD provided the two major reports, and out of these recommendations were put to the countries. Italy is chairing the G7 next year. So again, there is an opportunity to follow up on that discussion, which is a bit neglected into the conversation about infrastructure as an asset class, to bring the attention to what is needed. And what is needed, as you rightly said, is member countries, government action. And I see a key role from the European Commission. I don't know if Harold is still connected, but I think beyond the TEN-T revision, there is clearly a big role that the Commission, in terms of steering the investment towards green infrastructure and resilience, can do through the Green Deal sort of schemes. All the funding, as I mentioned, which is flowing to the recovery plan according to the taxonomy criteria, do no significant harm. Which do include resilient aspects. And Italy was, for example, a case study for an OECD report which was published just recently, having an integrated approach to green infrastructure, going through case studies where actually this can be done. And it's not straightforward. Mitigation is the focus of what we're doing, but of course there is the adaptation side. And another important piece of legislation from the Commission, which is forcing countries to look into these issues, is the Resilient Directive, the Critical Resilient Entities Directive, which was approved in December 2022, and needs to be implemented in 24 months by member states. And it does look at the resilient aspects broader than just physical infrastructure and climate infrastructure. including security, including the risk management approaches and the systemic approach, which I mentioned before, across the infrastructure sort of sectors, but also the operators, which are called as major actors, train operators, airport operators, road operators in each country, to come up with a resilient adaptation plan complying with national strategies. So this is a major opportunity to connect these different streams of regulation and make this a comprehensive approach, which is missing. Last point on private sector. So clearly we are behind where we need to be in terms of adaptation financing, as I mentioned before. When you talk to operators, to investors, financial investors, what they ask is, how do we invest into adaptation projects? There is no streamline of cash flows we're paying for an investment. There are a few initiatives trying to giving an answer to that. So what is the cost through the life cycle? What is the impact on my cash flows on OPEX and CAPEX of increased hazard or deterioration of my physical assets? How do you quantify that in financial terms, in terminal value, in value at risk that actually I need to take into consideration? And these are metrics and research, which is the cross board of practitioner and academia, and this is what actually we're focusing at Imperial College as well, trying to come out with the practical solutions for something for which we do not have an easy fix at the moment. Another example here, another initiative which goes in this direction is the International Coalition for Sustainable Infrastructure, which is leveraging the engineering community, which is very much needed beyond the financial investor community in the private sector sort of effort to invest in those assets. There is quite a number of initiatives which are linked to this body, which is, by the way, my co-author in the contribution to this report, Savina Carluccio. And there's going to be also a series of panels at the COP, Dubai COP, on resilience, trying to make this connection beyond climate to nature and to the rest, to the broader resilience sort of discussion we're having today.
Thank you, Raffaele. Now, so far, we have not mentioned the infrastructure. I mean, the most famous over the last year, the one by China, the Belt and Road. So where do we stand with the Belt and Road? What is happening? Are they reconsidering it? What are the benefits that they are spreading, if they are spreading benefits or not? Please.
Well, thanks for the question. Indeed, the origin of the Belt and Road was basically an infrastructure project, although it basically evolved very much beyond infrastructure. So if you think about already the first summit in Beijing 2017, there were already 3 types of connectivity. Infrastructure was only one of them. There were other 2, finance and people-to-people connectivity. So you can see that the concept itself has evolved gigantically, I would say. I would say the hardest part of this project, BRI, actually came during the pandemic. If we wrote a paper for Bruegel on the sentiment across the globe with big data, so basically looking at media all over the world and the sentiment about the BRI, and we found that the sentiment really tanked during COVID. And it recovered somewhat, and it actually went down a little bit, especially in Europe, after the invasion of Ukraine. But overall, it's not come back to previous levels. 2 things to add to this. The first one is that while infrastructure is indeed, I mean, if you look at the investments at the very beginning, especially from 15 to 18, the 2 biggest investments geographically are infrastructure. So the one is, of course, the pipelines in Russia and the railway in Russia. So these 2, railway all the way to Europe, obviously, and part of Siberia 1. So this is kind of about $60 billion. And then you have Pakistan, second one. And this is China-Pakistan Economic Corridor from the Karakoram all the way to Gwadar. and the port of Guadar. So yes, the bulk of the money has been spent in infrastructure. However, the nature of the project has evolved, as I said, enormously. First, because the money isn't there as much as it used to be. I have to say, when you look at the numbers now, actually, lending flows from China into the rest of the world, BRI in particular, are negative now. Are negative. There is disinvestment, and there is disinvestment because there is partially repayment. On the one hand, sometimes not even the repayment is happening, and the new flows, gross, because net, as I said, are negative, are in RMB, which is a very interesting phenomenon. At the same time, the nature of BRI is becoming more political, more security-driven. So you have concepts that are, in a way, building up the concept of BRI. There are three of them. China, in this order, by the way, China Development Initiative, China Security Initiative, China Civilization Initiative. The first very much already into quite a few of the UN, basically jargon by now. And this means that maybe this will, to your question, no longer be so much of an infra project, but rather civilizational project, kind of maybe global order type project than an infra project. So that's where we are heading, in my view.
Thank you very much also for being so clear on the point. Now I have the last question because time unfortunately is running out for Amitedu Palit. Amitedu, we have been talking about infrastructure in Asia and Southeast Asia, but there is a missing piece in our puzzle, which is an important actually piece, and that is the United States. So what are the United States doing in the region, for instance with the IPEF? I mean, what is going on also looking at Washington?
Thank you. Thank you very much for raising that question, Antonio. And I think the United States has, over the last 3 years, become a very active actor in the Asia Pacific, proceeding under the construct of the Indo-Pacific, which brings in the idea of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean countries working together. Several of them are originally from the Asia-Pacific group of countries, but you also now have India coming into the story as one of the most important Indian Ocean actors, that it all generated out of the original grouping of the Quad group of countries, which comprised the United States, Japan, Australia, and India. And now it has been formalized into a much broader arrangement, the one that you alluded to, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework of Prosperity, which alongside the 4 Quad countries comprises 7 countries from Southeast Asia and also has Korea and New Zealand and, very interestingly, Fiji becoming a part of this group. So there is an extension of this community through a process which is being actively led by the United States, and the initiative aims to actually not build itself as a free trade agreement, but rather as a process which would initiate a consensus on regional rule making on various ideas of trade facilitation and the cutting edge subjects of modern commerce and trade, like digital rules, critical minerals, and green and clean energy and green and clean infrastructure. And what is surprising is that this was kicked off on the 23rd of May 2022 in Japan. And since then, a fairly significant amount of progress has taken place. And the discussions on the IPEF are organized around 4 pillars. The trade pillar, the supply chain pillar, the clean economy pillar, and the fair economy pillar. And at the last meeting of the IPEF ministers in Detroit in the month of May, the second pillar, which is the supply chain pillar, and which was fast-tracked as one of the most important areas of work, actually reached a ministerial statement conclusion, and the outcomes have been publicly announced, and the ministerial text is expected to be notified soon. And there is an expectation that by the end of the year, and more specifically during the APEC Heads of State meeting in November, towards the end of the year, the remaining pillars will also be facing similar conclusions. So to come back to the question that you raised, Antonio, I think the United States is trying to recover a considerable amount of the ground which it had given up when President Trump took the US out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And that ground is being sought to be recovered by bringing the United States back as a prominent player in the regional rule-making space of the Indo-Pacific through critical areas of cutting-edge business and the 21st century issue areas. And of course, the major objective of all this is to counterbalance the Chinese influence of the region. But the interesting part is that the Indo-Pacific Initiative has obtained a fair degree of active support from a large number of countries in the region, which, by the way, are economically very organically linked to China, primarily from Southeast Asia. So there is, again, a very important geo-economic and geopolitical dynamic which is at work here.
Thank you very much. So unfortunately, we have to stop here for this very interesting panel. So let me thank again Raffaele Della Croce. Thank you, Raffaele. Erad Reuters. Alicia. Thank you so much, Alicia Garcia Herrero. And Amitendo Palit. Thank you very much. Now I leave the floor to Mr. Giorgio Santilli, because we have the second panel. Now we'll switch to Italian. So the second panel is Il punto di vista delle imprese, the point of view of enterprises. So I leave the floor right now to Giorgio Santilli. Thank you so much.